Chicago was engulfed in a blizzard that night, and a man lay dead on the sidewalk before Nurse Nyla Bennett. She could have walked past. She should have. But she didn't. And that decision changed everything. The man she pulled into her home that night wasn't an ordinary man. He was Draven Vale, a name the entire underworld of Chicago knew and feared. But the most dangerous thing wasn't that she saved him. The most dangerous thing was that he refused to leave. Which city are you watching in? Comment below to let me know how far my story has progressed. And don't forget to hit like so we can follow this journey to the end. The snow came down sideways that night. Not the soft, photogenic kind that made tourists stop on the Magnificent Mile and take pictures. This was the other kind, the February kind, sharp and mean and driven by a wind that cut through every layer of clothing like it had a personal grudge. The kind of storm that reminded Chicago it had always been a city built on hard ground, and that the ground didn't care who you were. Nyla Bennett had been walking for 11 minutes in it. She knew the exact number because she had been counting her steps since she left the hospital's staff exit, the way she sometimes counted things when her brain needed something small and mechanical to grip onto after a shift that had taken something from her she couldn't name yet. 11 minutes, maybe 400 steps. Her boots were already soaking through at the seams, and the wind was doing that thing where it seemed to pick a direction and then change its mind just to punish you for adjusting. She had just watched a man die. That wasn't unusual in the ER at St. Marcus Medical Center on the south side. People died there regularly. That was part of the work, the texture of it. And Nyla had made a kind of peace with death years ago that most people her age hadn't needed to negotiate with yet. She was 31. She had been a trauma nurse for 6 years. She had held hands through things that would dissolve other people. And she had walked back to her station afterward and kept moving, because that was what the work required. But Marcus Delaney had been 43 years old with a daughter named Sophia, who was 7, and who had drawn him a card in crayon that said, "Daddy come home soon," in uneven letters, and that card had been in his jacket pocket when they brought him in, and Nyla had found it when she was cutting away his clothes, and she had set it on the tray because she had actually thought, in the specific irrational way you think things during crisis, that if she kept it close and kept it clean, maybe the outcome would be different. It wasn't different. Sophia's father was not coming home. And now Nyla was walking through a blizzard because she couldn't face sitting on a bus with other people right now. Couldn't manage the overhead lighting and the smell and the proximity of strangers who didn't know what her hands had done in the last 8 hours and wouldn't understand if she told them. She had her head down against the wind when she almost walked into him. She stopped hard, her boots skidding slightly on the packed ice beneath the fresh snow. And her first thought was that someone had left something on the sidewalk. A duffel bag, maybe, or a pile of garbage bags from the shuttered pharmacy behind her that had been dark for 2 winters now. Iron gate rusted over its entrance, and a hand-painted closed sign in the window that had started to peel at the corners. Then she registered the shape of it, the length, the specific stillness. A man, face down on the sidewalk, one arm extended toward the curb like he'd been trying to catch himself when he fell, and only made it halfway. He was wearing a coat, black, heavy, good quality even from this angle and in this light, and the snow was already building up across the back of it, filling in the valleys of the fabric, which meant he had been down for at least several minutes, maybe longer. Nyla stood there for 3 full seconds. She was not proud of those 3 seconds, but she remembered them clearly. The moment of calculation, the internal voice that sounded reasonable and self-protective and said, "You don't know who that is, you don't know what happened. This is the South Side at 11:30 on a February night, and you are a woman alone and tired, and you are 4 blocks from your apartment, and you should call 911 and keep walking." And she almost listened to it. Almost. She crouched down and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. The pulse was there, but it was doing something wrong. Too slow and too faint, with an irregular stutter in it that she recognized from work. The specific rhythm of a body that had been cold for too long and was starting to make compromises. His skin was not just cold from the air. It was the deep cold, the internal kind, the temperature of someone whose core had been dropping for a while. Hypothermia, possibly advanced. She grabbed his shoulder and rolled him onto his back, and the snow shifted off him like a sheet being pulled away, and she got her first real look at his face. He was maybe mid-30s. Hard to tell. His features were angular in the way that suggested either good bone structure or the kind of weight loss that came from sustained stress, and even unconscious, he had a quality about him, a set to his jaw, a tension in the muscles around his eyes, that made him look like a person who didn't fully relax even in sleep. There was blood. A dark stain spreading through the left side of his shirt, visible now that the coat had fallen open, and more of it on his left hand where he'd pressed it at some point, and then stopped trying to hold it. Nyla did not ask herself what had caused the wound. She was in triage mode now. Assessment first. The wound was bad, but not immediately terminal. She couldn't be sure without better light and examination, but the bleeding had slowed, which was either good or very bad depending on what that meant about blood pressure. The hypothermia was the immediate problem. The hypothermia could kill him in the next hour without waiting for anything else. She pulled out her phone, called 911, got put on hold. The city was drowning in this storm. Every ambulance was deployed. Estimated response time was 43 minutes. Nyla looked at the man on the sidewalk, looked at the pharmacy behind her with its locked gate, looked at her phone, looked up Ashland Avenue at the orange glow of the streetlights fading into white static. She put her phone in her pocket. Then she grabbed him under the arms and started pulling. He was heavier than he looked, and she had to stop twice on the 4-block walk. If you could call it a walk, this half-dragging, half-leaning negotiation with dead weight and ice and wind, to readjust her grip and breathe. Her lower back began protesting around the 2nd block. By the 3rd, her shoulders were burning, and her fingers were so cold they'd moved past pain into a kind of abstract numbness that she recognized as its own warning sign. But she kept moving, because that was what you did when stopping meant someone died. Her apartment building was a 3-flat above a dry cleaner on Ashland, the kind of building that had been many things to many people over the decades and was currently in the middle stage of a slow gentrification that hadn't fully committed in either direction. Her unit was 2nd floor, which meant the stairs, and the stairs were almost the end of both of them. She got him to the landing on sheer stubbornness and a kind of furious single-mindedness that she would not have been able to explain later. And when she finally got him through her apartment door and onto her living room floor, she sat against the wall for a full minute with her eyes closed and her whole body shaking from the cold and the exertion combined. Then she got up and started working. She had training for this. Not this specifically. Not man I dragged in from a blizzard with an apparent stab wound and hypothermia, but the underlying mechanics of it, the ordered intervention, the list of priorities that her brain could run through when her emotions were still trying to catch up to events. She got the wet coat off him, and his jacket, and his shirt, and that was when she got a real look at the wound. 2 inches long, left side, upper abdomen, below the ribs. Deep, but the angle was wrong for anything immediately vital. At least she hoped. It had bled significantly and then slowed, which she chose to interpret as hopeful. She applied pressure with clean towels, held it, changed them twice, checked for any sign of internal bleeding she could assess without equipment she didn't have here. Then she started on the temperature. Quilts from the cedar chest in her bedroom, the ones her grandmother had made and that Nyla kept because they were the warmest things she owned, layered over him until she'd used every heavy blanket in the apartment. She turned the heat up as high as it would go, made hot water bottles from rubber gloves sealed with rubber bands, the improvised kind, and tucked them against his sides. She worked for 2 hours. She didn't sleep. She sat beside him on the floor with her back against the couch, monitoring his pulse and his breathing and the color of his lips, doing the small, constant adjustments that amounted to keeping him on the right side of a line that he'd gotten dangerously close to. Around 4 in the morning, his temperature had stabilized enough that she let herself exhale for the first time since the pharmacy sidewalk. Around 5, he began to move. Just small things at first, fingers twitching, a shift in the way his breathing moved through his chest, and then his head turned to the side and his brow creased with the effort of something, and Nyla was already leaning forward, watching, when his eyes opened. They were dark, very dark, brown so deep it read almost black in the low lamplight she'd left on, and they moved fast. That was the first thing she clocked, that the eyes of a man who had just spent hours on the edge of hypothermia with a stab wound in his side were moving fast and alert and assessing the room in sweeping, comprehensive arcs before they landed on her. Not the eyes of someone waking up disoriented. The eyes of someone who had been trained to process threat before anything else. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "You're in my apartment," Nyla said, "on the south side. You were on the sidewalk outside a pharmacy on Ashland. You've been out for about 5 hours." He didn't say anything. He was looking at the window, then the door, then back at her. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You had a core temperature low enough to kill you and a stab wound in your left side. I've been keeping pressure on it. The bleeding stopped, but you need a hospital." "No hospital," he said. His voice was rough and low, like something used to giving instructions in quiet rooms, and he said it with the flat certainty of someone who was not interested in discussing alternatives. "That wound could be deeper than I can assess here. No hospital." He tried to sit up, got maybe 6 inches off the floor before the pain registered, and he stopped, jaw tight, staring at the ceiling. "How bad?" "The wound? Bad enough. Not immediately fatal if you don't do something stupid like try to sit up." She paused. "Which you just did." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of one that had gotten a lot of practice being suppressed. "You pulled me off the street." "I did." "Alone. There wasn't anyone else." He looked at her again, and she had the specific, uncomfortable experience of being examined by someone who was used to reading people for information rather than connection. The kind of look that took inventory instead of making contact. "Nyla," she said, because she figured knowing her name might make her feel less like an object being evaluated. "Bennett, I'm a trauma nurse at St. Marcus." "Draven Vale," he said. Just his name. No explanation, no context, no apology for bleeding on her floor or the inconvenience of almost dying outside a pharmacy. She didn't recognize the name then. That would come later. "Do you know who stabbed you?" she asked. "Yes." "Are they going to come here?" He considered this with the same economy he seemed to bring to everything. "Not tonight." "That's not as reassuring as you seem to think it is. It's what I have." He looked at the quilts piled over him, and then at the improvised hot water bottles, and something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully read, something between acknowledgement and something older than that. "You used rubber gloves." "I used what I had." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll be gone before morning." "You won't," she said. "You'll be hypothermic again in 20 minutes if you go outside. Your core temperature is still not where it should be. You lost blood. You need to stay put until I can reassess in daylight." She met his eyes directly, because she had learned years ago that, in a crisis, hesitation read as uncertainty, and uncertainty made everything harder. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you what your body needs. What you do with that information is your choice." Another long silence. The wind pressed against the windows. The radiator knocked and hissed. "All right," Draven Vale said. And that was the beginning of it. Nyla didn't sleep that night. There was no version of sleep available to her with a stranger on her living room floor. A stranger who was currently stable, but who had a wound she couldn't fully assess, and a history she didn't know, and eyes that swept every surface in the room like they were memorizing exits. She made coffee at 6 in the morning because she needed something to do with her hands, and she brought him a cup without asking if he wanted one. He took it without commenting on it. That was something. She watched him from the armchair, working on her second cup, and tried to organize what she knew. He was maybe 35. The coat had been expensive, high cashmere blend, good lining, not off the rack. His hands were clean, but there was something about them, a specific economy in the way they moved, that made her think of people she'd treated who came from violent backgrounds. Not sloppiness, the opposite, a precision that came from practice. "Who are you?" she asked. Not rudely, just directly. He looked at her over the coffee cup. "I told you." "You told me a name." That's usually what people mean when they ask who someone is. Not always. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You said no hospital. You're not surprised someone stabbed you. You spent the first 2 minutes awake checking my windows and door. So, who are you, Draven Vale?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Someone who makes problems disappear for people," he said finally, "and someone who occasionally becomes the problem." "Is that what happened last night?" "More or less." "The person who stabbed you, are they a problem you're going to make disappear?" His eyes moved to hers. "Are you always this direct?" "I work in trauma care. I don't have a lot of use for indirection. She put her cup down on the coffee table. I'm not asking because I'm scared. I'm asking because if someone's going to show up at my door at 3 in the morning, I'd like some advance notice. Something changed in his face at that. A very slight recalibration, like a scale finding its balance. No one's coming to your door. You're not involved. I dragged you off the sidewalk and put you in my living room. That doesn't make you involved. That makes you someone who helped a stranger. A pause. Which is not something I've had a lot of experience with. Nyla looked at him. He looked back. The February light was beginning to come gray through the kitchen window, and the wind had dropped slightly. Still cold, still cutting, but the worst of it had passed with the night. The radiator knocked steadily. The apartment smelled like coffee and the specific clean chemical scent of the medical supplies she'd used, and somewhere below them the dry cleaner was beginning to open for the day. The mechanical roll of the security gate, a distant percussion. There's ibuprofen on the table, she said. Take 4 of them. I'm going to get more supplies from the hospital before my shift starts. Do not leave this apartment. He said nothing. I'm serious. You leave, you're going to tear that wound open, and the next person who finds you might not be a nurse. You're not worried I'll go through your things? She stood up, found her coat on the hook by the door. If you do, you'll find a lot of medical textbooks, half a bag of rice, and a letter from my landlord about the heating situation. She buttoned the coat. Nothing worth your time. She was almost to the door when he spoke. Nyla. She stopped. Why did you do it? He asked. Pull me off the street. You didn't know me. She thought about Sophia's crayon card, about 43 years old, about a body that had already surrendered before anyone could decide it should. I was having a bad night, she said, and I needed to do something that worked. She left before he could respond. She came back 2 hours later with supplies from the hospital supply closet she'd borrowed without exactly asking. The kind of borrowing that a nurse with 6 years of Southside ER experience did, with the specific moral pragmatism of someone who'd long since made peace with the gap between rules and reality. He was still there. She hadn't been entirely sure he would be, despite what she'd said, but he was sitting up now, back against the couch with her grandmother's quilt still across his lap, and he was looking at his own phone with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Eyes flat, jaw set, something moving behind his face that he was working very hard not to show. You got bad news, she said. He looked up. Your face, she explained, setting her bag on the coffee table and beginning to take things out. You got bad news while I was gone. He put the phone face down on the floor beside him, said nothing. You don't have to tell me. She pulled on nitrile gloves. But I'm going to need to properly look at that wound, which means you'll have to take your shirt off again, and this might be uncomfortable. She worked carefully and methodically, cleaning and assessing the wound under better light than she'd had at 4 in the morning. And as she worked, she became more certain about what she'd initially hoped. The angle was poor for major organ damage, and while the wound needed proper closure, the field dressing she'd done during the night had managed the bleeding well enough that she could work with it here. She applied proper closure strips and a better dressing, checked for infection, assessed his range of motion, gave him specific instructions about what to watch for. He sat through all of it without complaint. Without flinching, really, which told her something about what his threshold for pain was and where it had been built. When she was done, he said, You're very good at this. I know. No qualifier. I've been doing it for 6 years in one of the busiest trauma ERs on the South Side. I earned the lack of qualifier. That almost smile again. Something slightly more of it this time. She stripped off the gloves. Tell me something. That depends on what you want to know. The person who stabbed you. How does this end? He was quiet for a moment. Badly for them. I meant for you. He turned the question over somewhere behind his eyes. It was strange to watch. She'd seen a lot of people consider their answers before speaking, and most of them were working through what to say. He looked like someone working through what to admit. I don't know, he said finally. There are variables I can't account for right now. That's the most honest thing you've said to me. I've been honest. You've been accurate, Nyla said. Those aren't the same thing. She gathered her supplies back into the bag. Sleep. Your body needs it whether you think it does or not. I have a shift in 2 hours. She looked at him. You can stay, if you need to. He watched her. I don't know you, she added. I don't know what you are or what you've done or what's coming after you. But you needed help last night, and I had it, and that's the full extent of my reasoning. Draven Vale looked at her for a long moment. Most people who know what I do, he said slowly, don't want to be in the same room with me. Most people don't spend their nights pulling strangers off icy sidewalks either. She picked up her bag. Get some sleep. She was at the bedroom door when she heard him settle back against the couch. The quiet shift and exhale of someone allowing themselves to stop holding against the weight they'd been carrying. She lay down on her bed without changing out of her work clothes, staring at the water stain on her ceiling that had been there since she moved in, listening to the wind against the glass and the city moving below and the particular silence of a man she didn't know occupying her living room. She should be afraid. She ran through that thought honestly, checking it against her actual internal state, and found that what she was instead was something more complicated. Alert, yes. Uncertain, but not afraid. What she was, underneath everything, was curious. About the bad news on his phone that he'd turned face down on the floor. About what kind of man made problems disappear and could take a knife and hypothermia in the same night and still move his eyes that fast when he woke up. About why a man who clearly had resources. The coat, the phone, subphones, the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to having options, had been alone on a Southside sidewalk bleeding in a blizzard. About what variables he couldn't account for looked like. She was still thinking about it when her alarm went off an hour later. She went to work. She treated 8 patients. She came home. He was gone. He had made the bed, or rather he had folded her grandmother's quilts with precise military neatness and stacked them on the couch, and washed the coffee cups, and left no other evidence of himself except 2 things. The first was the note on her kitchen table. No greeting, no signature. Just a phone number written in a tightly controlled hand. If you ever need anything. The second was the blood. Not a lot. She'd managed the wound well enough that it hadn't bled through the dressing. Just a faint reddish-brown stain on the hardwood floor in the shape of where he'd lain for most of the night, already drying at the edges. Nyla stood over it for a moment. Then she went and got the cleaning supplies. She was on her hands and knees working at the stain when she noticed it. A sound from the street below, the particular idling growl of a car engine that had been there when she came home and was still there now, pointing toward the building, not moving. She stood up slowly and looked down through the window from an angle that kept her from the sight line. Dark sedan. Engine running. She couldn't see the driver from here. She picked up her phone, looked at the number on the kitchen table, put it back down, picked it up again, and stood there in her apartment above Ashland Avenue, in a city buried under February snow, with a cleaning cloth in one hand and a choice she hadn't quite made yet in the other, while the car below her window sat perfectly still in the cold and didn't go anywhere. Dad. The car was still there when Nyla turned off her lights at midnight, and when she woke at 3 a.m, heart hammering without understanding why, she went to the window and found it gone, replaced half a block down by a different car, a different make, same perfect stillness, same running engine cutting white exhaust into the frozen air. Someone was watching her building, and Draven Vale had been gone for less than 12 hours. The second car was gone by morning. Nyla stood at the window with her coffee going cold in her hand, looking at the empty stretch of curb where it had been, and tried to decide if she had imagined it. She hadn't. She knew the difference between the ordinary overnight parking patterns of her block and something that didn't belong, and what had been outside her building at 3 a.m. had not belonged. She drank the cold coffee anyway, got dressed, went to work. She didn't call the number on the kitchen table. She told herself that was the rational choice. She didn't know who Draven Vale was beyond a name and a set of eyes that moved too fast and a wound she'd closed with field supplies in her living room. She had no obligation to him. She had done the human thing, the medical thing, and he had left, and that was the cleanest version of how this could have gone, and she was going to leave it there. She believed that for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, she came home from a double shift, 16 hours, 2 traumas, 1 code that went the wrong way, and left her standing in the corridor outside the family waiting room, listening to a sound she would never fully get used to, and found a coat hanging on her door handle. Not inside. Outside in the second-floor hallway. Charcoal wool. Heavy. The kind of long, structured coat that cost more than 2 of her monthly paychecks and would actually keep a person warm in a Chicago winter, as opposed to the layered fleece situation she'd been running since October. There was no note, no card, no explanation whatsoever, just a coat on a door handle in a building that required a key to enter. She stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then she took it inside. Because it was a coat and it was cold, and whatever else Draven Vale was, he had impeccable taste in outerwear. She didn't call the number, but she put it in her contacts under D instead of leaving it on the table. The first time she actually used it was 11 days after the night in the storm. It was past midnight. She was sitting on the floor of her kitchen after getting back from the community center on 63rd. She volunteered there 3 evenings a week, working with teenagers who needed someone to talk to that wasn't a cop or a caseworker, and she had her back against the cabinets and her knees pulled up in a very specific kind of exhaustion that wasn't about hours awake, but about the weight of what a person accumulated when they spent their days in proximity to suffering. A 16-year-old kid named Darius had told her tonight that he'd been offered a position. That was the word he used. Position. Because he was smart enough to understand that what he was describing required vocabulary that kept it at arm's length, that made it sound like a business decision rather than a door that once opened would spend the next decade trying to kill him. She'd talked to him for 2 hours. She didn't know if it had been enough. She picked up her phone and typed, "Do you ever get tired of the math?" She stared at it for a second, then sent it before she could think about what she was doing. The response came back in under 2 minutes. What math? The math where you calculate whether what you did today was worth what it cost. A longer pause this time. She imagined him somewhere. She didn't know where, didn't know what his life looked like from the inside beyond the negative space of what he'd told her, reading that on a screen and deciding whether to answer honestly. Every day, he wrote, "It doesn't get easier, you just get faster at the calculation. That's terrible." Yes. She laughed before she could stop herself, a short, startled sound in her empty kitchen. Then, "How's the wound?" "Fine." Fine is not a medical assessment. It's not infected. The closure held. I can move without it pulling. That's actually a reasonable answer. I had a good nurse. She put the phone face down on the floor and sat there a minute, feeling something in her chest that she didn't immediately want to identify. Then she picked it back up. "The coat fits." "I know." "How do you know?" "Because I measured." She stared at that for a moment, then typed, "That's slightly alarming. I pay attention to people. It's a professional habit. Most professionals don't buy strangers custom winter coats. I don't do well with conventional expressions of gratitude. I noticed." Another pause. Then, "Get some sleep, Nyla." She did, eventually. But not before she lay in the dark for a long time thinking about a man who paid attention to the measurements of a woman he'd known for one night and called it a professional habit, and whether the difference between that and something else was as clear as she wanted it to be. The calls became a pattern without either of them acknowledging that they were becoming a pattern. Late nights, after her shifts, after her evenings at the community center. Sometimes he initiated. A text first, then a call when she picked up. And sometimes she did, though she was slower to admit that to herself. He was a careful conversationalist in a way she hadn't expected, which was to say he asked real questions and listened to the answers with a quality of attention that was so complete it occasionally made her feel slightly unmoored, like being in bright light after a lot of dark. He told her things gradually. Not everything, not even close, but pieces. The way someone pulls threads loose from a tightly wound spool, controlled, deliberate, giving just enough to maintain the connection without giving so much that it couldn't be taken back. He had come up in this city, not in the south side, but near it, close enough that he understood the specific mechanics of what she described when she talked about Darius and the other kids at the center. He had built what he built starting at 19, which meant by the time he was her age, he had been doing it for over 15 years. And she understood enough about what that required to understand what 15 years of it did to a person. He controlled. She was assembling this picture from the edges, from what he said and what he pointedly didn't say. Distribution networks. Multiple. Across several corridors of the city, both geographic and legal, with alliances in places she recognized as significant even without a full map of the territory. The scale of it was larger than she'd initially estimated. The violence was quieter than she'd feared and more present than she wanted to know about. She did not pretend she was fine with it. She also did not pretend he should be someone else. What she noticed, instead, was the loneliness, not self-pity. He had none of that, not an atom, but the structural loneliness of a person who had built something so large and so requiring of fear that there was no one left in his life who could treat him like a man rather than a position. People obeyed him, leveraged him, feared him, or wanted something from him. The category of people who simply talked to him without an angle appeared to be, before her, essentially empty. "Do you have friends?" she asked him once. Direct, because she didn't know how else. A pause on the line. "I have people I trust." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said. "It's not." "Draven." "There's a man named Cortez," he said. "He's been with me since the beginning, longer than anyone." Another pause, weighted differently. "He's the closest thing." "What's he like?" She heard something shift in his voice when he answered, a softening that was almost invisible, like a room's temperature changing by 1 degree. "Stubborn. Better at this than he gives himself credit for. Reads people wrong when he likes them too much." A beat. "He keeps telling me I need to stop." "Stop what?" "Everything." Nyla was quiet for a moment. "What do you say when he tells you that?" "I tell him it's too late." "Do you believe that?" The pause was the longest he'd given her. "I used to," he said finally. "I'm less certain than I was." She held the phone against her ear in the dark of her bedroom and didn't say anything because she understood the weight of less certain than I was coming from a man who had built his entire existence on the architecture of certainty, and she didn't want to disturb it with words. Boss. 3 weeks after this blizzard, the men outside her building changed rotation. She noticed because she was a person who paid attention, always had been. It was the same quality that made her good at her job, the constant low-level processing of the environment, flagging anomalies. The dark sedan had been replaced by a gray SUV, had been replaced by a black truck, and the pattern of it was wrong in the same way it had been wrong that first night. Same idling distance, same angle to the building's entrance, different vehicles, same behavior. She called Draven at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. "There's a black truck outside," she said, no preamble. "This is the 3rd vehicle in 3 weeks. Different makes, same position." Silence on the line. 3 seconds of it. And in those 3 seconds, something changed in the quality of his silence. She had learned to read that. The difference between him thinking and him already knowing. "Go away from the window," he said. "Draven, Nyla, away from the window right now." She moved, sat on the floor of her kitchen with her back against the cabinets. Mirror of 11 days ago. "What is this?" "Someone checking whether you matter to me." She let that land. "Do I?" Another pause. "Yes." The word was so simple and so stripped of everything decorative that it hit her somewhere underneath her ribs. "That's why they're watching." "Yes." "Who?" "A man named Rafael Verano. He runs the East Corridors. We've been—" He stopped, chose another word. "In conflict." "What kind of conflict?" "The kind that doesn't end without someone losing." His voice was controlled, but she could hear something underneath it. Not fear. She didn't think Draven Vale had a conventional relationship with fear, but something tighter, more personal. "He's been looking for leverage. He doesn't believe I have attachments. He's been trying to establish whether that's changed. And he thinks I'm the attachment." "Yes." "Because you bought me a coat and call me every night at midnight." "Because I'm careless," he said, and his voice had an edge to it she hadn't heard before. Directed inward, she realized, not at her. "I'm careless with you in ways I can't entirely explain." Nyla pressed her back harder against the cabinet. The refrigerator hummed beside her. From below, faint street noise, the city doing its ordinary nighttime business, while a man she'd known less than a month told her she was being surveilled because he'd called her too many times. "I need to know what this means," she said, not in diplomatic language. "What does it mean that Verano thinks I matter?" Draven was quiet for a long moment. "It means you're not safe the way you were before." "How not safe?" "I don't know the full shape of it yet. That's the truth." A pause. "I have people watching your building. You may not see them, but they're there. You're not unprotected." "I didn't ask if I was protected. I asked how not safe. Nyla, don't do that. Don't manage me. A breath on the line. The first time she'd heard something like frustration from him. He won't move on you directly. That would be a provocation he's not ready for yet. What he'll do is watch and wait and use what he learns. His voice was careful and hard. Which means the longer you're associated with me, the more useful you become to him. So what does that mean for us? The question hung there between them, heavy with everything it contained besides the literal meaning. Every midnight call, every conversation, the code on the door handle, the bad night math. I'm less certain than I was. It means, Draven said slowly, that I should stop calling you. Is that what you want to do? The pause was so long she thought she'd lost the connection. No, he said. It's the farthest thing from what I want to do. She closed her eyes, pressed her fingertips against her forehead. Then we figure out what we're actually doing here, and we do it with our eyes open. It's not that simple. I know it's not simple. I work in trauma care. I mentor kids who are one bad decision away from a morgue visit, and I just found out there's a man surveilling my building because he thinks I can be used to hurt you. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for honest. A very long silence. Come to me, he said finally. What? Not tonight. Tomorrow. I'll send a car. I need to show you something, and I can't explain it over a phone. What are you going to show me? What I am, he said. All of it, without the careful editing. A pause. You should know before you make any decisions. Nyla sat on her kitchen floor with her phone pressed against her ear and the hum of the refrigerator beside her and the quiet city below, and felt the specific weight of a door that was standing open in front of her, fully lit on the other side, showing her clearly enough what was there. All right, she said. She heard him exhale. Unsung. The car came at noon the next day. Black. No plates she would have recognized as anything. Driven by a man who said nothing except Ms. Bennett when she came down and held the door with the particular practiced neutrality of someone employed to be furniture. She had told exactly one person she was going. Camille, who was her closest friend and a surgical resident at Northwestern, and who had listened to the entire story with the focused attention of someone mentally composing a response, and then had said, very levelly, Nyla, I love you. Please tell me the address. Nyla didn't have an address. She sent Camille a pin when the car stopped. The building was in the West Loop. Not the new money part, not glass and exposed steel and rooftop restaurants, but the older part, the one that had been industrial before anyone was paying attention and still had the bones of that in its brick and its height and the way the windows were built for function rather than aesthetics. The penthouse. A private elevator. Draven met her at the door. He looked different than she'd seen him. Not the collapsed hypothermic man from her living room floor, and not the carefully composed voice on the phone. Dressed simply, dark clothes, and standing in his own space in a way that was different from either of those versions. More himself, she thought. The posture of a person at home in their environment, which made the environment feel more like an extension of him than a neutral backdrop. You came, he said. I said I would. He held the door wider. She walked in. The apartment was what she expected and not what she expected. She had anticipated something performative. The architecture of wealth as demonstration, the thing that powerful men often built around themselves to prove the power outward. Instead, it was clean and spare in a way that read almost ascetic. Very few objects. The furniture was good but not ostentatious. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, but they were uncurtained and plain, as if the view was just the view and not a statement. What caught her eye was the table. Central, long, and covered with documents, maps, printed communications, a laptop open to a spreadsheet that she couldn't read from this angle. The table of a working mind, not an entertainer. Sit, he said, or stand, whichever. She stood. He crossed to the table and she watched him look at it for a moment. The look of a person reading a situation they know well and seeing something that's changed. What happened? She said. He glanced at her. Why do you assume something happened? Because you look like you got bad news between last night and now, same as the morning after the blizzard, when you were looking at your phone. She moved a few steps closer to the table. You do this thing with your jaw when you're working something through that you don't want to show. A muscle in his jaw moved. She almost smiled. Cortez, he said, Your friend. There's been a problem. He picked up a document from the table and held it without opening it. Someone inside my organization has been passing information to Verano for approximately 8 months. His voice was level and controlled, the way voices got when the control was the whole point. I've known there was a leak for 6 weeks. I didn't know the shape of it until 2 days ago. How bad? Bad enough that several operations I thought were protected weren't. Bad enough that Verano has been 3 steps ahead of me on the east side since November. He set the document down again. Bad enough that I've spent 8 weeks not knowing which of the 3 people I trust most is the one I shouldn't. Nyla looked at him. 3 people? Who are the 3? Cortez. A woman named Iris who handles my finances, and a man named Soto who manages distribution. He said all 3 names with the same weight, which she understood meant he had been carrying all 3 as suspects equally, which was its own form of sustained pain. I have to be wrong about 2 of them. I have to be. A pause. But I've been wrong about people before. What happens when you find out who it is? His eyes moved to her face. What do you think happens? I'm asking you. He was quiet for a long moment. What needs to happen? He said finally. Not what I want. That's not the same answer. No, he said. It's not. Neela crossed her arms against her chest, not defensively, more like she was holding herself still against something she was feeling. Why are you showing me this? You could have told me the surveillance situation on the phone. You could have told me to be careful. Why am I standing in your apartment looking at your table? Because I told you I was going to show you everything without the editing. He looked at her directly, and she had the full force of those dark, fast-moving eyes steady on her face in a way that they hadn't been yet. Not scanning, not assessing, just on her. Because I don't know how to be careful with you the way I should be. And I decided last night that either I stop entirely or I stop pretending. A pause. And I can't stop entirely. The skyline was doing something gold and brutal behind him. Winter afternoon sun hitting the glass of 10,000 windows all at once. So instead you're choosing to be honest, she said. I'm trying. About all of it. Yes. She uncrossed her arms, walked to the table, stood beside him and looked at the documents the same way he'd been looking at them, like they were a problem that required solving, not a performance of something. Tell me how it works, she said. The leak. How does information move? What's the shape of it? He looked at her from the side. You don't need to, but Draven. She turned to face him. I am a trauma nurse who volunteers in gang-adjacent communities and has been watching your building get surveilled for 3 weeks and is standing in your apartment because you asked me to come with your eyes open. Remember? I'm here. My eyes are open. Tell me how it works. Something happened in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the jaw set, not the scanning, not the careful management of what he showed. Something that looked, briefly, and with the quality of something rarely allowed surface, like relief. He pulled out the chair at the table. She sat down. And for the next 3 hours, Draven Vale told her the truth. 10. It was early evening when the call came through. They had been at the table for a long time. Him talking, her listening, and asking questions with the same focused diagnostic attention she brought to a complex presentation in the ER. Her mind pulling structure from chaos, identifying the places where the logic broke down and the information didn't track. She was good at this. She was finding. Not the specific territory of it, but the underlying problem. The way a system under stress developed patterns, the way a breach didn't stay contained. He had been watching her work through it with an expression she was choosing not to examine too closely. When his phone buzzed, he picked it up with the automatic reflex of someone always waiting for the next thing, and she watched his face when he read it. She had learned to read the changes in his face. This one was different from all of them. Draven! He put the phone face down on the table. What happened? She said. His hands were flat on the table, very still. Cortez is dead. The word landed like something dropped from a height. What? They found him this afternoon. It was... He stopped. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were moving across the table, but not reading anything, just moving, the way eyes moved when the mind was doing something too large for stillness. He refused. That's what I'm being told. Verano made him an offer. He refused. Draven. He's been with me for 14 years. His voice was level. The levelness was the most frightening thing about it. Not because it was cold, but because she could hear exactly how much force it was taking to keep it level. He taught me half of what I know. He argued with me every week for the last 4 years about whether any of this was worth what it cost. A breath. He was the one telling me to stop. Neela sat very still. And someone killed him for it, she said quietly. For not selling me out. His eyes moved to her. They were different now. The scanning was gone, the assessment was gone, and what was there underneath was something raw and older and much less managed. Which means the traitor isn't Cortez. Soto or Iris. Yes. And they know you know. A pause. If Verano had Cortez killed tonight, then yes. Someone told Verano that Cortez had become a liability. Someone who knows my organization well enough to know that Cortez finding out about the leak would be the end of it. His voice was very quiet now. Someone who is watching every conversation I have and every move I make and is still inside. The apartment had gone dark outside while they'd been talking, the skyline shifting from gold to blue-gray to the nighttime orange of a city's ambient light. Inside, the table lamp cast a circle of yellow over the documents, and outside that circle, everything was shadow. Neela looked at him. He was looking at the phone. You need to make a decision, she said. I know. Not tonight. Tonight you need to... She stopped, because she had been about to say grieve, and she didn't know if that word applied in the world he lived in, didn't know if it was something his architecture allowed for. Tonight you don't have to figure out everything. If I don't move quickly, the traitor will cover their tracks. Verano will move on the exposed operations. I'll lose the east corridors and everything built off them, which cascades into... He stopped, pressed his fingers hard into the table. I know what needs to happen. I just... Draven. She put her hand on his arm, just on the forearm, through his sleeve. Not a dramatic gesture, not anything performed, just contact. The human specific. I know what needs to happen can be true, and also tonight is still tonight. He looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face. I haven't... He started. Stopped. Tried again. I don't have a lot of experience with this. With what? Someone being here. Without wanting something. The table lamp threw shadows across his face that made the angles sharper, and outside the Chicago skyline burned orange against a black sky, and Nyla Bennett, who had learned to take the temperature of a moment the way she took the temperature of a patient, understood that she was sitting at an exact juncture, that this was the place where a choice got made, not dramatically, not with a declaration, but in the specific ordinary way of two people in a room deciding what the room was. I want things, she said. I want Darius to not take that position. I want the clinic I'm trying to get funding for to have an actual building someday. I want the heating in my apartment to work properly. She looked at him. I want you to not be alone with this tonight. He was very still. That's not nothing, he said. No, it's not nothing. She took her hand off his arm. So, talk to me. Not about Verano, and not about the leak, and not about what needs to happen. Tell me about Cortez. What he was like. And Draven Vale, who controlled shipping corridors and distribution networks and the quiet violence of half a city's underworld, looked at her for a long, unguarded moment. Then he started talking. She didn't leave until past midnight. He walked her to the elevator, and they stood there for a moment in the hallway outside it, with the silence of two people who had spent a long evening removing certain distances and were now at the end of the evening with those distances still removed. The car will take you home, he said. I know. I'll have someone on your street tonight. You won't see them. Draven, I know. She looked at him. Will you be all right? He considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything. I'll be functioning. That's also not the same answer. No. The corner of his mouth moved, that ghost of something. I'll be better than I was this afternoon. Good. She pressed the elevator button. Call me when you know something. You shouldn't be involved in... Call me, she said, when you know something. I'm not asking you to protect me from information. I'm asking you to not disappear into this alone. The elevator opened. She stepped in. He was standing in the hallway with his hands loose at his sides and his face in the particular stillness of someone watching, something leave and not knowing how to ask it to stay. And Nyla held the door for one extra second and looked at him directly and said nothing, because there wasn't a sentence for what she meant that wouldn't break something, and then the door closed. The car took her home through the nighttime city, past the orange lights and the elevated trains rattling sparks into the dark. And Nyla sat in the back and pressed her shoulder against the cold window and thought about a man sitting alone in an apartment full of documents and one fewer person than he'd had that morning. She was still thinking about it when the car slowed on Ashland. When it stopped, the driver said, "Ms. Bennett." She looked up. "He wanted me to tell you. The streetlights on your block. They've been repaired." The driver's eyes were visible in the mirror, neutral and professional. "You won't have to walk from the corner in the dark anymore." Nyla looked out the window. Her block was lit, properly lit, every lamp burning orange and steady down the length of the street. The broken ones she'd reported to the city 3 times without result, suddenly whole and working in the middle of the night. She sat there for a moment, then she got out of the car. She was 3 steps from her building entrance when she heard it, fast footsteps behind her, too fast, coming from the alley beside the dry cleaner, and she had exactly enough time to turn before a hand came down hard on her shoulder, spinning her, and a man's face was close to hers. Mid-30s, hard, a phone raised and pointed at her, and a voice that said low and cold, "Tell him we found his soft spot." The picture flash of the phone camera, then footsteps retreating. Gone before she could react, before she could scream, before the tears that arrived completely without her permission could amount to anything except her standing on a lit street in front of her building with her heart slamming and her hands shaking and the absolute concrete certainty that something had just changed, that whatever line had existed between her life and Draven Vale's world had been crossed not by her choice, but by someone else's. And there was no version of, she called him before she was inside the building. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she mistyped the passcode twice, standing in her own doorway with her back against the frame and her eyes on the mouth of the alley where the man had come from. But the alley was empty now, just brick and shadow and the orange reflection of the newly lit street lamps on wet pavement, ordinary and still, as if nothing had happened there at all. He picked up on the first ring. "Someone just grabbed me on my street," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. That was the training, the part of her brain that ran the clinical track regardless of what the rest of her was doing. "Not grabbed, touched my shoulder, turned me around. A man. Mid-30s, hard face, I'd recognize him. He took my picture and said, tell him we found his soft spot." Silence on the line. Not the thoughtful kind, the kind where someone was already moving. "Get inside," Draven said. "Lock everything. Don't open the door for anyone except the man I'm going to send. His name is Reyes. He'll say that." "Draven, are you hurt?" "No, I'm not hurt. She stopped. Decided to be honest. "I'm shaking. That's normal." His voice was very controlled, and underneath the control she could hear something she hadn't heard from him before. Something cold and absolute that had a different quality than his ordinary composure. "You're not in immediate danger. The photo was a message, not a threat." It felt like a threat. It was designed to. A pause. "Get inside. I'll call you in 10 minutes. "Where are you going?" But he'd already ended the call. She got inside, locked everything, stood in her kitchen with her back against the counter and waited for her hands to stop shaking, which took about 4 minutes. She tracked it against the clock on the microwave, the way she tracked vital signs, something to quantify in the middle of the unquantifiable. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. And then her hands were steady again, even if the rest of her wasn't. The knock came 8 minutes later. A specific pattern. 3, then 2, then 1. "Reyes," the voice on the other side said. She opened the door. He was compact and quiet, maybe 40, with the kind of face that didn't offer information. He did a sweep of her apartment that took less than 90 seconds and was so efficiently unintrusive she barely registered it happening. And then he positioned himself in the chair nearest the door and said, "Mr. Vale will call shortly." And that was the entirety of his conversational contribution for the rest of the night. Draven called 11 minutes later. "Reyes will stay through the night. Tomorrow, you're going to a different location, somewhere Verano doesn't have a map for. I have work tomorrow, she said. I have a shift. I know, we'll manage it. A pause. I'm sorry, Nyla. The apology landed differently than she expected. Not perfunctory. Something in the grain of it was real and uncomfortable. The specific quality of an apology from someone who didn't give them often. You didn't send that man. I put you in the position that made you a target. You also put streetlights on my block at midnight. She pressed her fingertips against her forehead. I'm not interested in assigning blame right now. I'm interested in what comes next. What comes next is I find out who did this and that's not what I mean. She moved to the window, keeping the angle she'd learned. You said someone inside your organization is feeding Verano. You said 2 people, Soto or Iris. A pause. You had Cortez killed last night. You have a picture of me in someone's phone tonight. Draven, whoever is doing this isn't stopping. They're escalating. A long silence. Yes, he said. So the question isn't who you're going to find. The question is how much damage they can do before you find them. Another silence, different from the first. You're thinking about this like a containment problem, he said. I think about everything like a containment problem. It's my job. She turned away from the window. Tell me what they can access. Whatever the leak has already given Verano. Financial channels, operational corridors, locations. Tell me what's exposed. Nyla, you don't need to... Draven. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, and she let it stay sharp because sharp was accurate right now. A man grabbed me on my street tonight. He took my picture. He called me your soft spot, which means Verano already has leverage he didn't have yesterday morning, which means the timeline has changed. So I would like to know what I'm standing in the middle of, completely, without the careful editing. We established that last night. The silence on the line had a different texture now. Not reluctance, recalibration. The east corridors are compromised, he said. 3 financial channels that route through shell structures in Iris's portfolio. If she's the one, those have probably been mapped for Verano already. The distribution schedule Soto manages for the south routes. If it's him, Verano knows every pickup window for the next 6 weeks. His voice was even and methodical, which she understood was how he managed the enormity of what he was describing. The location of this apartment, the names of everyone who moves through my organization at a management level. Cortez's network, which was separate from the main operation and is now... He stopped. Gone. With him. Nyla sat with that for a moment. And Verano's going to move, she said. He'll wait until he thinks the timing is right. He likes to move from a position of total advantage. A pause. He'll want to see how I respond to tonight. Whether I panic, whether I make mistakes. So the photo was a test. Also a message, and a demonstration that he can reach you when he wants to. She was quiet for a moment. How long do we have? Days. Maybe a week. His voice tightened slightly. Which means I have to find the leak before that window closes. What do you need to do that? Access to conversations I shouldn't be able to access. Communications between Verano's people and someone in my organization that my people haven't been able to find because whoever is looking is being redirected. A pause. I need someone outside the system to look at it. Someone Verano hasn't mapped. Yes. Nyla looked at the middle distance of her kitchen. I have a contact, she said slowly. From the nonprofit medical program I work with. She's a biotech executive, but her background is data architecture. Secure communications infrastructure, she owes me from something I helped her with 2 years ago. She paused. I'm not promising anything. I'm not asking you to promise. His voice was quiet. I'm asking you to still be here. She thought about this man from the alley, about the camera flash, about standing on her own street feeling her hands shake. I'm here, she said. The safe location turned out to be a brownstone in Pilsen that belonged to no one. Verano had a file on. She didn't ask the specifics of how Draven maintained properties that were effectively invisible, because there were categories of his operation she was making deliberate choices about the depth of her understanding on. She arrived the next morning with a bag she'd packed in 8 minutes, Reyes driving, and another man she didn't know in the passenger seat. The brownstone was clean and sparse, in the way the penthouse was sparse, and someone had stocked the kitchen in a way that suggested whoever had done it had been given a list of specifics: the particular coffee she bought, the exact brand of the yogurt she kept in her fridge. She stood looking at the kitchen counter for a moment and felt something complicated and unnameable about the level of attention that represented. Draven arrived 2 hours later. He was dressed as she'd seen him at the penthouse, dark, simple, but there was something different about him that she cataloged before she could stop herself. His jaw was tight in the specific way that suggested he'd been tight-jawed since the night before and hadn't stopped. He was moving through the brownstone with a purpose that didn't allow for stillness, checking windows, speaking in low, rapid exchanges with Reyes, and it was several minutes before he came and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "You slept," he said. "Some." "Good." He pulled out the chair across from her at the small kitchen table and sat, and she saw then that he had his phone and a tablet and a folder, and that underneath the tight jaw there was something in his eyes that had been working through the night. Iris. One word, but the weight of it. "It's Iris," Nyla said. "I'm not certain yet. I'm close." He opened the folder. There are 3 communications in the last 8 months that move through financial channels Iris controls where the timing maps exactly to Verano, making moves he shouldn't have been able to anticipate. 3 times. Each time, within 48 hours of Iris processing certain transfers. He slid the folder across the table. "I need someone who's not me to look at this and tell me if I'm reading it correctly." Nyla looked at the documents. Financial records, timestamps, routing information. She was not an expert in this the way she was in other things, but she was competent with structured data, and she understood the logic of systems that were supposed to be opaque and what it looked like when they weren't. She worked through the pages slowly. He waited. He was very good at waiting when he needed to be. "The third one," she said finally. "This transfer routed through 2 additional shells that the first 2 didn't use." "Yes." "That's not efficiency. That's someone adding layers when they got nervous." "Yes." "And the timing on all 3, she traced the dates with her finger. "These aren't coincidences." "No." He sat back in the chair. "They're not." "Have you confronted her?" "Not yet. I need to be certain before I—" He stopped. "Before you do what needs to happen," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Yes." She put the folder down. "What does confronting her look like?" "It looks like a conversation in a room she can't leave until I have the truth." Nyla held his gaze. "Will she be alive when the conversation is over?" The question landed in the space between them with the specific gravity of something that had needed to be asked for a while. He didn't look away. "That depends on what she tells me. And if she tells you everything, then I have Verano's playbook and a traitor who is no longer a threat." A pause. "I have not made a habit of cruelty for its own sake." "That's not the same as innocent people walking away." "No," he said. "It's not." She was quiet for a long moment. She was not going to pretend the world she was sitting in had the moral architecture of the one she operated in during her working hours. She had known that since the night in the storm, in the specific way you knew things you hadn't fully let yourself know yet. "Do what you have to do," she said, "and tell me when you're done." Something moved across his face, something like relief and something like the weight of being known, and something like not being sure those were comfortable feelings. "There's one more problem," he said. He placed the tablet on the table. On the screen was a photograph. She recognized it as security camera footage, a parking structure, concrete columns, the bland geometry of a structure designed for utility. Timestamp in the corner, 2 nights ago. In the photograph, a man was handing an envelope to another man. The second man she didn't know. The first man she did because she had treated him in the ER 4 months ago when he came in with a cut that needed closure, and he had remembered her name and brought her coffee from the cart next time he was in the building. The first man was Dr. Warren Holt, her attending physician at St. Marcus, her direct supervisor. "What is this?" she said. Her voice came out very flat. "Verano has a man inside St. Marcus Medical Center," Draven said. "He's been there for some time. This is what the envelope contained." He took the tablet back and pulled up an image of documents, personnel records, her personnel record. "Your schedule, your home address, your emergency contacts." He paused. Your patient access codes for the hospital database, which map every time you enter and exit the building. Nyla stared at the photograph. Dr. Warren Holt, 11 years at St. Marcus. Her attending. The man who had written her performance review last year and called her the best trauma nurse in his department. The man who knew her schedule, her rotations, her patterns, every access point she used in the building. How long, she said. The first contact we can trace is 5 weeks ago. Shortly after, Draven paused. Shortly after Verano's people identified you. 5 weeks. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. He has been giving Verano my schedule for 5 weeks. Yes. While I was treating patients, while I was going to work and coming home and thinking the surveillance was just... She stopped. Breathed. Dr. Holt has been giving that man my access codes. Nyla. I trusted him. Her voice was very even, which she understood was its own kind of danger signal. He signed off on my certifications. I covered his shifts when his wife was sick. She stopped again, pressed the flat of her hand harder against the table. Did he know? About me specifically. Did he know I was a... She couldn't quite finish the sentence. He knew you were associated with someone Verano wanted leverage over, Draven said quietly. I don't know if he knew what that leverage would be used for. That's not better. No, it's not. She sat very still for a long moment. Outside, the Pilsen morning was making ordinary noises. A truck on the street, someone's dog, the distant mechanical sound of something being built somewhere. The normalcy of it was almost offensive. What do we do with this? She said. We use it. He leaned forward slightly. Holt doesn't know we have this photograph. He doesn't know the surveillance on you has been identified, which means if we feed something through you, through the hospital, through a channel he's monitoring, we can control what Verano receives. You want to use me as a conduit for false information. I want to use the channel he built without his knowledge that we have it. A pause. It would require you going back to the hospital, acting as though nothing has changed. Nyla looked at him for a long moment. And what happens to Holt when this is over? Draven was quiet. He's not yours to deal with, she said flatly. Whatever he did, he's not yours. Nyla, he will be turned over to people who handle things through systems with oversight and records. Her voice had the specific quality of a person drawing a line they will not move on. I will not be part of something that makes him disappear. That is not negotiable. Draven looked at her. The jaw was tight again. But he said, agreed. She believed him. She chose to believe him, which was not the same thing but was the only thing available to her. When do we move? Today. I need to find Iris first. He stood up. And I need you to call your contact, the data architect. I'll call her now. He was at the kitchen doorway when she said his name. He stopped. After this, she said, when Iris is dealt with and Verano is dealt with and all of it is done. She looked at him directly. What are you going to do? He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he said. That's the most honest answer I have. It's enough, she said. For now. She called Maya Chen at 9:15 in the morning and was done explaining before 9:22, and Maya was quiet for a long moment and then said, How much of this do I actually want to know? Probably less than I've told you, Nyla said. And this person, this situation, you're in it. Fully. Voluntarily. Mostly. Nyla, Maya's voice had the specific quality of someone who was about to say something careful. You pulled a man off a sidewalk. I know. And now you're in a brownstone in Pilsen, helping him dismantle a criminal organization from the inside. I know. And you're not leaving. A pause. No. Okay. Maya exhaled. Send me what you have. I need 3 hours. She sent the files Draven gave her and then sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and did the thing she had trained herself to do in the middle of a crisis, which was the simple mechanical act of making an ordered list of what she knew and what she didn't and what the gaps were. It was a triage habit. It helped. What she knew, Iris was the probable leak. Holt was compromised. Verano had a picture of her and was prepared to use her. The east corridors were exposed. Draven had, at best, days before the window closed. What she didn't know, Whether Iris would confirm or deny. Whether the false information play through Holt would work. Whether Draven's organization could survive what had already been given away. Whether the two of them would be standing on the other side of this. She was still at the table when Draven came back. 2 hours had passed. She hadn't noticed. She looked at his face when he came through the door. "You found her," she said. "Yes." "And?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat heavily. Not the controlled sitting of someone managing their presentation, but the sitting of someone who had been carrying something large and had just set it down on an uneven surface. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "It was Iris," he said. "I know. You said..." "No." He looked up. "I mean, it was Iris from the beginning. Before the 8 months I traced. Before the financial routes." His voice was very flat and very quiet. "She's been working for Verano for almost 2 years. Since before Cortez died. Since before any of what I found." A pause that seemed to cost him something. She was the one who told Verano about Cortez. She was the one who marked him. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. "Cortez," Nyla said. She told Verano that Cortez was close to discovering the leak. She gave the order. He said gave the order with the specific carefulness of someone choosing words that kept them at functional distance from what they meant. "Cortez is dead because Iris told Verano he was a problem." Nyla sat with that. She had known, abstractly, that the world she'd stepped into contained this. She had made a deliberate choice to keep her eyes open, to not look away from the reality of what Draven was and what surrounded him. She had thought she was prepared. She understood now that prepared was a category that didn't quite apply to hearing that a woman had ordered the death of a 14-year relationship because she was afraid of being found out. "How long had Cortez known her?" she said. "As long as he'd known me." Draven's hands were still flat on the table. "Longer, actually. He introduced us." A pause. "She knew everything about him, about me, about every person I trusted." His jaw worked. "She had full access because I gave it to her. Because I..." He stopped. "Because you trusted her," Nyla said. "I trusted her more than almost anyone." The kitchen was very still. "Where is she now?" Nyla said. "Dealt with." His voice left no opening in that phrase. "She won't be giving Verano anything else." Nyla did not ask what dealt with meant. She made the same deliberate choice she'd been making since she sat across this table from him an hour after Cortez's death, and decided to know him without flinching away from the knowing. "Then we moved to the next phase," she said. He looked at her. "Just like that. Just like that." She put her palms flat on the table, mirroring him without meaning to. "Grieving Iris is a luxury. Verano is still active, and he still has a map of your exposed operations, and he still has a picture of me on someone's phone." She met his eyes. "The window is closing. What do we do with the time we have?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something passed through his face that she had learned to recognize, that brief, involuntary thing that happened when he was caught off guard by who she was in a given moment. "Maya," he said. "What did she find?" "She called 20 minutes ago." Nyla picked up her phone. She found the routing architecture Iris used. It maps every channel Verano currently has access to: financial, operational, communications. All of it goes through 3 primary nodes. She turned the phone to show him. "Here, here, and here." He looked at the screen. His eyes moved very fast. "If you close those nodes," she said, "Verano loses his entire informational advantage simultaneously. Closing those nodes means restructuring almost everything, moving money, changing routes, rebuilding the communication architecture from the ground up." He looked up from the phone. "That takes time I don't have." "How long does it actually take if you start right now and don't sleep?" A pause. 48 hours. Maybe less. And Verano's window is days, maybe a week. If we're lucky, she held his gaze. Then we start right now. We. You heard me. He was still looking at her. The penthouse light had been gold and cinematic. The Pilsen morning light was flat and ordinary, coming through a kitchen window above a sink with a slow drip, and it illuminated the specific reality of 2 people at a table deciding to do a hard thing. "This is not your fight," he said. "It became my fight when a man grabbed me on my street." A pause. "And before that, honestly." Nyla, Draven. I have Maya's architecture map. I have contacts in biotech and nonprofit finance that Verano has never heard of, and therefore can't have mapped. I understand systems, and I understand the way they break, and I have been doing triage for 6 years, which is nothing but prioritizing what saves and what doesn't in a limited time window. She looked at him steadily. Tell me honestly that you can do this alone in 48 hours. He said nothing. That's what I thought. She put the phone face down. So, where do we start? They started with the money. Maya worked remotely, patched in through a secure connection Draven's people established in under an hour. And Nyla watched her contact and Draven's people talk to each other in the shorthand of people who operated in parallel worlds that turned out to have more in common structurally than anyone wanted to admit. Maya was good, very good. The kind of good that came from years of building things meant to be invisible, and she moved through Iris's exposed architecture with the specific focused aggression of someone who understood exactly what had been done and wanted to take it apart. The first node closed by 2 in the afternoon, the second by 7. Between those closures, Nyla called Camille, who was the only person she trusted with the information she needed to pass. The plan for Holt, the controlled feed of false information through the hospital channel. She kept it as stripped as she could. Camille listened with the surgical focus that made her exceptional at her job and said, "What exactly do you need me to do?" "Nothing that could touch you. I just need you to tell me if Holt accesses my personnel file again after this afternoon. And if he does, then we know the channel is still active." Camille was quiet for a moment. "Nyla, are you safe?" "Right now, yes. That's a very specific qualifier." "I know." A pause. "I'll explain everything when it's over." "You'd better." Another pause. "I'll watch the access logs." By midnight, Draven had rebuilt the communication architecture for his primary operations through 17 new channels that Iris had never touched, and therefore Verano had no map for. Nyla had watched the process and asked enough questions to understand the shape of it, not the criminal specifics, but the architectural logic, the same way you could understand the mechanics of a complicated surgical procedure without being a surgeon. They were at the brownstone table with food neither of them had properly eaten, and coffee that had been reheated twice when Maya called. "Third node," Maya said. "I can close it in 2 hours, but it's going to require moving a significant sum through a channel I'm going to need authorization to touch." Draven took the phone, spoke for 90 seconds, handed it back. "She has authorization," he said. "She's going to want to ask me questions later," Nyla said. "She should. She helped dismantle something she didn't fully understand for someone she doesn't know." He picked up his coffee. "She trusted you." "Yes." "You have people who trust you completely." "Some." She looked at him. "You trust Reyes." "Yes." "And Soto." "Soto isn't the leak." "No, Soto is—" He paused. "Soto I've known since before any of this. He will be what he is when all of this is over." "What about you?" she said. "What will you be?" He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. The Pilsen street had gone to late-night stillness, just occasional car sounds and the distant elevated train, and the lamp on the table threw them both in sharp relief. "I don't know yet," he said. "I keep coming back to the same answer when you ask me that." "I know." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I'm asking because I need to know if the thing we're building in the next 48 hours is something you want to live in afterward, or whether it's just another version of what you already had." His eyes were steady on her. "What's the difference?" "The first one means you restructure because you have to. The second one means you restructure because you want something different on the other side." She held his gaze. "I need to know which one this is." He was quiet for a long moment. "Both," he said finally, "and the second more than the first." It wasn't a complete answer. She suspected he didn't have a complete answer yet, but it was the most honest thing he could give her, which was something she had learned to value more than completeness. "Okay," she said. "Then let's finish this." Holt accessed her personnel file at 6:47 the following morning. Camille's text came through while Nyla was on her third coffee and her second hour of going through the financial restructuring documentation with Maya, who had not slept either and was running on something Nyla chose not to ask about. She showed Draven the text. "The channel is active," he said. "He checked right after his shift started." She put the phone down. "Whatever we feed through, he'll pass it to Verano within hours. Then we feed it now." Draven had the specific focused quality of someone who could see the entire chessboard and was 2 moves from the end of the game. "I need you to make one call to the hospital, to someone Holt would believe you'd confide in." "About what?" "About a meeting." He looked at her. "I want Verano to believe I'm coming to him, that I've assessed the situation and I'm ready to negotiate." A pause. "I want him to believe I'm desperate enough to come to his table." "You're not going to his table." "No." His voice was very level. "He's coming to mine." Nyla looked at him. At the table with its restructured maps and its 48 hours of rebuilt architecture and its closed nodes and its severed connections. At the man across from it who had just spent 2 days dismantling everything his enemy thought he had and building something new in the space where it had been. "You're going to offer him the meeting," she said slowly, "and by the time he walks in, everything he thought he had leverage over will be gone." "Yes." "He'll be furious." "Yes." "He might not walk away from that room." Draven looked at her for a moment. "He will," he said. "I'm going to give him the option." A pause. "That's the part you changed." She didn't ask what she'd changed. She thought she understood it. She picked up her phone and called Camille. Camille answered on the second ring, and Nyla said what she needed to say in the kind of careful language that would sound like something else to someone like Holt, but would land exactly right for the person it was meant for. She hung up. She and Draven looked at each other across the table. "Now we wait," he said. "Now we wait," she agreed. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in the first thin days of approaching spring. Not warmer yet, not quite, but carrying in the air the distant rumor of something thawing. The Pilsen street was waking up in its ordinary morning way, and somewhere across the city, in the east corridors and the financial routes and the distribution networks that had been mapped and surveilled and handed to an enemy over the course of 8 months, the architecture had already changed. And in a building on the south side of the loop, a woman named Iris had already taught Verano everything she knew, which was now a map of something that no longer existed. Nyla sat at the table with her cold coffee and looked at the man across from her who had not slept in 36 hours and who was running on something she couldn't fully name. And she thought about Darius at the community center who was standing in front of a door that would spend the next decade trying to kill him, and about Sophia's crayon card, and about the specific mathematics of a choice made in a moment that then became all the choices that followed it. She had pulled a man off a sidewalk in a blizzard. She was sitting in a kitchen in Pilsen, having helped dismantle a criminal intelligence network in 48 sleepless hours. She was looking at a man who had told her the truth about everything, and was now looking back at her with the specific expression of someone who understood that what happened next between them was not about the operational problem anymore. Her phone buzzed. "Camille. Holt just left the building early. Hasn't done that mid-shift in 2 years." She turned the phone so Draven could see it. He nodded slowly. "Verano has the message," she said. "Yes." "How long until he responds?" "He's a careful man. He'll verify. He'll check whether I'm actually exposed the way the message implies." Draven's eyes were distant, tracking something internal. "When he can't confirm my position is as weak as the message suggests, he'll get curious. Curious men come to meetings." A pause. 12 hours. Maybe less. Nyla looked at her phone, at the brownstone kitchen, at Draven. "I want to be there," she said. "No." "Draven, no." His voice was very flat. "This is the one thing I will not negotiate with you on. Where this meeting happens, you will not be." She looked at him. "Because," he said more quietly, "if you're there, I will be watching you instead of the room, and I cannot afford that." A pause. "And because you've already done more than you should have had to." She wanted to argue. She recognized the wanting and made the deliberate choice not to follow it, because she also recognized that he was right, and that there were moments when the right choice didn't require debate. "All right," she said, "but I want a phone call the moment it's over." "Yes." "And I want Reyes to stay here until it is." "He's already staying." She nodded, stood up, stretched her back. 36 hours of that table had opinions about it. I'm going to sleep for 3 hours. You should too. I can't. Draven. She looked at him. 3 hours. Then you'll be sharper for the meeting than you are right now. She held his gaze. That's medical advice. From someone whose professional assessment you've been taking since you woke up on my floor. A long pause. That almost smile. Slightly more of it than she'd seen before. 3 hours, he said. She was at the hallway door when she heard him stand from the table, the specific sound of the chair pushing back. And she felt rather than heard him cross the room, and then his hand was on her arm, just as she'd put hers on his, light and specific and very human. She turned. He was standing close enough that she could see the exhaustion underneath his eyes, and the tension that hadn't left his jaw in 3 days, and the thing in his expression that had no careful editing over it anymore. I need you to know something, he said. She waited. When this is over. His voice was very quiet. I intend to be something different than what I've been. He held her eyes. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I know it looks like... He stopped. Like not being someone you have to justify being associated with. Nyla stood very still. You don't have to justify that to me, she said. I want to, he said. That's the part that's new. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her hand over his on her arm, briefly, the same simple contact as before. 3 hours, she said. Then go win. She went down the hall and closed her bedroom door and lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the brownstone settle around her in its ordinary morning sounds and understood with the specific clarity that came from 2 days of no sleep and high stakes and the kind of honesty that stripped everything unnecessary away, that she was not standing outside this anymore. She was in it, completely. And somewhere across Chicago, Rafael Verano was reading a message that told him Draven Vale was ready to negotiate and making the first move toward. Verano responded in 9 hours. Not 12. 9. Which told Draven something about the man's patience, or the current state of it, before a single word of the message had been read. The response came through a channel that was technically neutral, a third-party broker both organizations had used for exactly this kind of communication for years. And it was brief in the way that things were brief when the person writing them wanted to project control. Calumet River Warehouse. Tonight, 10 o'clock. Come alone. Draven read it standing at the brownstone window, watching a Pilsen Street do its late afternoon business in the gray February light. And he read it 3 times because the second and third readings were not about comprehension, he'd understood it on the first pass, but about the specific mental act of memorizing the exact shape of an opponent's confidence before you walked into the room with them. Come alone. Verano believed Draven's organization was fractured, believed the intelligence he'd received through Iris had given him a complete picture of the damage, the exposed corridors, the severed alliances, the dead informational architecture of a man who had spent 8 months being quietly gutted from the inside. He believed he was walking into a room with someone who had already lost and was coming to formalize it. That belief was the trap. Draven put the phone in his pocket and went to find Reyes. He woke Nyla at 7. She came to the kitchen doorway with 3 hours of sleep on her face and her hair pulled back and her eyes immediately alert in that way she had, not performing wakefulness, actually achieving it, the way a person did when they had trained themselves to be present fast because the work required it. It's tonight, he said. She looked at him for a moment. How long do you need? I'm leaving at 9. I want the location mapped before Verano's people arrive. He moved to the counter, had coffee already made. I need to tell you something before I go. She came the rest of the way into the kitchen, took the cup he handed her, waited. If it goes wrong tonight, he said, Maya has a file. Your name isn't in it anywhere. Nothing that connects you to any of this is in it. You will be... Don't, she said. Nyla, don't brief me on what happens if you don't come back. Her voice was flat. That's not a conversation I'm having. He looked at her. Win, she said. That's the plan. Win. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Not agreement exactly, something more like acknowledgement of who she was, and turned back to the counter. Tell me the shape of it, she said. What's going to happen in that room? So he told her. Not everything. The operational specifics were his to carry alone, but the architecture of it. Verano expected surrender. He would find instead the documents, the restructured empire, the closed nodes, the decentralized partnerships that had been built in 48 sleepless hours with Maya's architecture and Nyla's contacts and Draven's knowledge of every legal corporate shield available in the state of Illinois. Every financial channel Verano thought he could seize would already be inaccessible. Every operational corridor he'd mapped would have been moved. He'll have nothing to take, Nyla said slowly. Nothing he can reach. And then you offer peace. And then I offer peace. A pause. From a position where he understands that pressing further costs him more than it costs me. She was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in her hands. He might not accept that. He might not. What happens then? Draven was quiet. Then it becomes a different kind of meeting. She didn't push on that. He appreciated that she didn't push on that. Come back, she said. That's the plan, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. The warehouse was exactly what the address had promised. A long, low industrial structure on the Calumet River's south bank. The kind of building that had once processed something large and mechanical, and now processed nothing except the specific silence of abandonment. Sheet metal walls, concrete floor the size of a city block sectioned by support columns, high windows that had been dark for so long the glass had gone milky. The river ran black and cold behind it, and the February wind came off the water with a sound like something being dragged. Draven arrived at 8:42. His people had been there since 7:30. Reyes and 4 others, positioned and invisible in the upper structure of the building, in the catwalks above the main floor that no one used anymore. He trusted each of them in the specific way he trusted very few people, which was to say, he trusted them with his life because they had each already chosen it over alternatives. He stood in the center of the warehouse floor and felt the cold come up through the concrete into his boots, and looked at the space and thought about every room he'd walked into in the last 15 years, every negotiation, every moment that was really about something other than what the words said, and understood that this one was different because the stakes were different. And the stakes were different because of something that had changed in him over the last month that he was still in the process of understanding. He had something to go back to now. That was new. He heard Verano's cars at 9:58. They came in through the north entrance, 4 men first, doing a sweep that was thorough and professional and didn't find Reyes or anyone else because Reyes was very good at this particular skill. Then Verano. Rafael Verano was 51 years old and built like someone who had started lean and never softened. He wore good clothes with the ease of a person who had worn good clothes for long enough that they'd stopped being a statement. His face was sharp-boned and still, and his eyes had the quality that Draven recognized from mirrors. The eyes of someone who had spent so long in rooms where violence was a possible outcome that they had stopped registering it as an exceptional condition. He came through the door and walked to the center of the floor and stopped 20 feet from Draven and looked at him across the cold industrial space. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Thunder moved outside, distant, rolling across the city from the lake like something clearing its throat. A winter storm working itself up to something. You asked for a meeting, Verano said. His voice was even and controlled. A man who had rehearsed his own composure for decades. I did, Draven said. You look better than I expected. I had a good week. Something shifted in Verano's eyes, a very small recalibration. He had expected something different. Defeat looked a specific way, and Draven wasn't wearing it, and Verano was smart enough to notice that immediately. I was told you were ready to discuss terms. I am. Draven reached inside his coat and removed a folder, held it out. These are the terms. One of Verano's men took the folder, brought it to him. Verano opened it without looking away from Draven first, the move of someone who understood that eye contact was its own kind of information, and then he looked down at the documents. The warehouse was so quiet that Draven could hear the river behind the walls. He watched Verano read, watched the stillness in the man's face develop a different quality. Not the controlled stillness he'd walked in with, but the stillness of someone whose internal landscape was shifting while the external held. Page 2, page 3, page 4. Verano looked up. These are restructuring documents, he said. His voice had changed, not dramatically, but the evenness had a different texture now, like something pressing against the underside of it. Yes. Filed 2 days ago. Yes. These channels. Verano stopped. His jaw moved. He looked back at the documents. These are all of Iris's routes. Were, Draven said. Past tense. A silence. What did you do with Iris? Verano said carefully. She's been dealt with. Draven kept his voice level and neutral, and let the phrase sit there exactly as he'd learned it from Nyla's own usage of it. A closed door that communicated everything and required no elaboration. Verano looked at the documents again, turned to the financial section. Draven watched the man's face and saw the precise moment he understood the scope. The moment a person registered that what they thought they were going to take had already been moved, redistributed, restructured into configurations that would require years of new intelligence to map, and that years were not something on offer tonight. You knew, Verano said. You've known for long enough. You knew, and you let me at it. He stopped again. I let you run out the clock on a map of something that doesn't exist anymore, Draven said. Yes. The 4 men along the walls had moved. Subtle, less than 6 inches each, but Draven felt it the way you felt changes in air pressure, the specific atmospheric shift of armed men recalculating. His hand didn't move toward anything. He stood exactly as he had been standing, coat open, both hands visible, because everything about his posture was the posture of a man who had already won and knew it and needed the other person to understand that. You brought 5 men, Verano said. His voice was flat now. I came alone, Draven said, as requested. A pause that contained several calculations running simultaneously. 6 people up in the catwalk says different, Verano said. 4, Draven said, and they're there to make sure this conversation stays a conversation. Another silence. Longer. The river moved outside. The thunder was closer now. Something building over the lake. The specific electrical quality in the air that preceded a serious storm. Verano closed the folder. He held it for a moment, just held it, and Draven understood that what he was watching was a man doing a very fast and very unpleasant piece of arithmetic, running the numbers on what the documents meant against what he'd spent 8 months building toward, and arriving at an answer he had not prepared for. What do you want? Verano said. Peace, Draven said. Real and lasting. No moves on my corridors. No surveillance on my people. No. He paused and let the pause have weight. No one on Ashland Avenue. Verano's eyes sharpened. The woman. She is completely outside this. From this point forward, she has never been relevant. Draven's voice was very quiet now, the quietest it had been. That is not negotiable. You built an entire restructure to protect. I built an entire restructure because you forced my hand, Draven said, and for the first time his voice had an edge in it. Not loud, the opposite of loud, but carrying the specific register of something absolute. The woman is incidental to that. What I'm telling you about the woman is separate from the business, and you should treat it as such. Verano looked at him for a long moment. You care about her, he said, almost to himself. I'm offering you peace, Draven said, and I'm asking you to understand that the offer exists because I'm choosing to make it, not because I have to. He let that sit. You're a careful man. You understand risk calculation, so calculate this. Everything you thought you had is gone. Your inside access is gone. Your intelligence map is 6 weeks out of date and restructured beyond recovery. Whatever you move against me from this position, you move blind. He looked at Verano steadily. And I will not be offering this conversation again. The warehouse held its breath. Thunder cracked directly overhead, close enough that the sheet metal walls rang with it, and the lights that Verano's men had set up in the corners flickered and held. And in that momentary stuttering light, Draven watched Rafael Verano's face go through something complicated. Rage and calculation, and the specific pride of a man who had never been outmaneuvered without warning, working through each other in real time. One of Verano's men said something in Spanish, low and urgent. Verano raised a hand, silenced him. The silence stretched. Draven did not move, did not shift his weight, did not blink first or look away or give the performance of patience. He simply was patient, in the specific, genuine way of someone who had already done the hard thing and was now waiting for the other person to catch up to it. "The east corridors," Verano said finally. "Stay where they are. Yours." The distribution window through "Stays as agreed. I have no interest in the lower south routes. I never did." Verano looked at the folder in his hand. "And what do you get?" "My people stay working. My corridors stay mine. And no one touches anyone I care about." A pause. "That's a significant offer. I'd take it." Another silence. Then Verano folded the documents and slid them into the inner pocket of his coat. "I'll need time to—" "No," Draven said. "You won't. You'll decide now, in this room, because this offer doesn't exist after tonight." He held Verano's gaze. "We're both too old for the version of this where you go away and think about it and come back with counterterms. You know exactly what this situation is. Decide." The longest silence yet. Draven's heartbeat was steady. He had expected adrenaline. The meeting had carried it in for the first 20 minutes, the specific physiological response to walking into a room where things could go very badly, very fast. But somewhere in the last 5 minutes, it had settled into something else. Something calmer and more final. The specific stillness of a man who understood that he had done everything he could do, and now the room would do what the room would do. He thought about Nyla in a Pilsen kitchen saying win. He thought about Cortez at 22 arguing with him about whether a specific decision was wise, being right, and knowing it, and being too loyal to walk away over it. He thought about 48 hours and a table covered in documents, and a woman who had sat across from him and asked to understand the shape of a system under stress, and had done it with the same focused attention she brought to keeping people alive. He held Rafael Verano's gaze and waited. Verano reached into his coat pocket. Every nerve in the warehouse fired. Reyes shifted overhead. Draven heard it, barely, the creak of a catwalk beam taking adjusted weight. Verano pulled out a phone. He made a call. 47 seconds. 3 short sentences in Spanish that Draven understood and which translated to the specific administrative instructions of a man standing down an operation in progress. He put the phone away. He looked at Draven. "The woman," he said, "was never a target." "Good," Draven said. "And Iris's situation is concluded," Draven said, "from both sides." A pause. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not anything that would survive outside this room, but the specific acknowledgement of two people who had been in the same world for long enough to understand each other's language. Verano nodded once. He turned and walked to the north entrance. His men followed, the last one pulling the door shut behind them. And then there was nothing in the warehouse except Draven standing on a concrete floor with thunder cracking outside and the river moving in the dark behind the walls and the sound of Reyes coming down from the catwalk, boots on metal stairs, unhurried. Draven exhaled. It came out longer than he expected, a full breath's worth of something he'd been holding for weeks. Not just tonight, but since the blizzard. Since the first moment he'd woken up on a stranger's floor and understood that something in his life had changed in a way he hadn't consented to and couldn't undo and didn't, underneath everything, want to. Reyes came to stand beside him, said nothing for a moment. "That's it," Reyes said. "That's it," Draven agreed. "You're going to call her." "Yes." "Before you do." Reyes's voice was careful. Reyes was very rarely careful. "There's something you need to know first." Draven turned to look at him. Reyes was holding his phone out. On the screen was a text from a number Draven recognized as the contact at St. Marcus, the monitor they'd placed to watch for any further activity from Holt. He read it. The warehouse went very still inside his chest. "When?" he said. 20 minutes ago, while you were in the meeting. She's... Reyes had 2 people on the building, Reyes said quickly. "She's not hurt. But Holt..." A pause. "Holt didn't go to Verano's people with the false information. He went to someone else. Someone we didn't account for." Draven looked at the text again. A second man. A second relationship with Verano's organization that had existed parallel to everything they'd mapped. That Iris had known about and not disclosed because it was her insurance. Her way of ensuring that even if she was caught, the structure she'd built would survive her in a form that could still be used. A second leak that had been active the entire time. And this one had Nyla's home address, her work schedule, her access codes, and had used the last 20 minutes while Draven was in a warehouse watching Verano fold documents to send 2 people to the brownstone in Pilsen. Draven was already moving. Reyes was beside him, both of them at the north door. And outside the winter storm had finally committed. Rain slamming the Calumet River flat, lightning walking across the lake in white crooked lines, the city swallowed in the kind of weather that made everything both louder and more alone. He called her as he ran. It rang 4 times. 5. He hit the car door and Reyes was driving before it was fully closed, and the phone was still ringing, and outside the storm was doing what February storms did in this city, arriving without apology, taking up all available space, indifferent to what was happening underneath it. 6 rings. 7. Then the line clicked. "I was in the bathroom," Nyla said, slightly out of breath. "What happened? Did it—" "Get away from the windows," he said. "Right now. Where's Reyes?" "Reyes left 10 minutes ago," you said. "I know what I said. That changed." His voice was controlled and fast, and he could hear her movement through the phone, the specific sound of someone responding to instruction in real time. "There are people coming to the brownstone. Get to the interior room, the one with no windows. Lock the door." Draven, "What?" Iris had insurance. A second contact we didn't know about. He could see the highway entrance, Reyes taking the on-ramp at a speed that suggested Reyes had also understood the urgency without requiring it to be explained. 20 minutes. I'm 20 minutes out." A pause. Small. He heard her breathing. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. Of course it was. "I'm in the interior room." "Good. Stay on the line." "I'm staying." A pause. "Draven." "I know." "How bad?" He looked at the rain hammering the highway in white sheets, at the city's orange light smeared across the wet windshield, at the distance between where he was and where she was measured in minutes that felt like something physical pressing against his sternum. "I'm going to get there," he said. "That's not what I asked." "I know." He pressed his hand flat against the window glass, cold and wet through the pain. "It depends on who they sent and whether they know we know." A pause. "It depends on the next 20 minutes. She was quiet. Then, "Drive faster." Reyes, without being told, drove faster. And Draven Vale held the phone against his ear and listened to Nyla Bennett breathe in a locked room in Pilsen, and the storm threw itself against the city with the specific fury of something that had been building for a long time. And 20 minutes away in a brownstone on a street he had never wanted her to be in danger on, the last piece of a betrayal he hadn't— The first thing she heard was the rain. It came in sheets against the brownstone's side wall. The interior room had no windows, which was why Draven had told her to go there, and the absence of glass meant the storm arrived only as sound, a sustained roar that made the walls feel thin in a way they probably weren't. She sat on the floor with her back against the far wall and her phone in her hand and listened to Draven breathe on the other end of the line while Reyes drove through a city drowning in February rain. "Talk to me," she said. 15 minutes. "I know the timeline. Talk to me about something else." A pause. She heard the car. The rain on his end was different. She could hear it hitting the windshield, the specific drumming of precipitation against moving glass. "What do you want me to talk about?" "Anything." She pressed her back harder against the wall. "Tell me about the clinic, the one you said you thought about." He was quiet for a moment. "I said I thought about what comes after. You said it looks different than what you had. I'm asking what it looks like specifically. Now." "Now." Another pause. Longer. She heard him shift in the car. The creak of the seat, Reyes making a turn that required speed. "Something smaller," he said finally. "Something that doesn't require fear to hold it together." He paused. "Something I could walk away from in 10 years without it collapsing." "That's a plan," she said. "That's an actual plan. It's a direction. Directions are where plans start." She was listening past her own voice for anything from outside the room. Footsteps. A door. The specific wrongness of a sound that didn't belong in the building's ordinary ambient noise. There was nothing yet. "Keep going." "Nyla." "Keep going, Draven. 14 minutes is still 14 minutes. A breath on the line. "The Southside real estate I've been holding. There are 3 properties I've never developed because the timing was wrong. One of them is 2 blocks from the community center. She heard something shift in his voice. The same thing she'd heard when he talked about Cortez, that involuntary softening. It's a good building, good bones, the right size for something that could actually serve the neighborhood instead of... He stopped. Instead of what you've been using it for. Yes, that's a good building, she said quietly. I know. She heard something. Not dramatic, not a crash or a shout or the cinematic announcement of threat arriving. Just a sound from somewhere below her in the building that didn't match the rain's rhythm. A footfall on the stairs. Then another. Careful, spaced, the footsteps of someone who was trying to be quiet rather than someone who lived here. Draven, she said. I heard it. His voice was very flat. Don't move. Don't open the door. I wasn't going to open the door. 12 minutes. She stared at the closed door of the interior room, a bedroom with no windows, queen bed, bare walls, the specific impersonality of a space maintained for operational use rather than living in. The door had a lock, a standard residential lock, which was not designed for anything serious, but it was something. The footsteps reached the second-floor landing. She could hear them clearly now. 2 sets, she thought, moving in a pattern that suggested coordination without being in communication, the practiced movement of people who had done this before. They were doing a sweep, going through rooms, 3 doors between this room and the landing. She had locked each of them when Draven called. She heard the first one open anyway. Locks, she thought, with a specific, cold clarity, were only as good as the door frames around them, and the brownstone was a 90-year-old building. She looked at her phone, looked at the room, looked at the closet door to her left. She made a decision. She crossed the room silently. Bare feet on hardwood, she'd taken her shoes off after Reyes left, and now she was grateful for it, and opened the closet. Inside, hanging space, empty rod, a shelf above, and on the shelf, pushed to the back, what she'd noticed when she first arrived and filed away as operational force of habit the way she filed everything. A fire extinguisher. Red, heavy. The kind that was mounted on walls in buildings built before anyone trusted residents to be responsible with them. She took it down with both hands, stood beside the closed bedroom door, pressed her back to the wall, and waited. The second door opened. Closer. She heard someone say something in a low voice. Spanish, she thought, not enough to catch. And then footsteps moved toward the bedroom. The door handle moved. It held for 3 seconds. Then the frame splintered, and the door came open and a man stepped in and turned toward the bed, because that was where a person would be. That was the instinct, and Nyla Bennett hit him across the back of the shoulders with the full weight of a 10-pound fire extinguisher swung from a full extension and 6 years of physical work that had left her considerably stronger than she looked. He went down, not out. She felt the impact travel back up her arms and knew from emergency experience that a blow to the upper back was not a guaranteed knockout. And she was already moving past him toward the door when his hand closed around her ankle. She went down hard, right knee and left palm on hardwood, the impact radiating up both limbs, the fire extinguisher skittering away. She heard the second man on the stairs. She was not going to outrun 2 people to the street in bare feet in a rainstorm. She knew that with the same clinical certainty she used to know things about patients. So she didn't try. She rolled, came up on her knees, grabbed the man's wrist with both hands, the hand that was still around her ankle, and applied the specific pressure point technique she'd learned from a self-defense course the hospital had run 3 years ago, and which she had practiced with the focused thoroughness she brought to skills she hoped she would never need. He released. She was on her feet before he'd finished releasing, and she had put the bed between herself and the door by the time the second man reached the frame. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the first man on the floor who was getting up slowly. He looked at Nyla, standing on the far side of the bed with her chest heaving and her palms bleeding where she'd caught herself on the hardwood, and her eyes absolutely steady. He raised his phone, not a weapon. He raised his phone and typed something, and Nyla understood in the specific analytical channel that ran constantly underneath everything else that she was being photographed again, that this was still the message, that Verano's second asset was not here to hurt her. He was here to demonstrate that he could. That Draven had shut down the visible structure and missed this one. That the insurance Iris had built was still operational, that the war wasn't over. Then Draven's voice came from the stairwell. Not loud, not a shout, just his voice, carrying clearly up the stairs with the specific quality she had come to recognize as his most controlled register, the one that was quieter than everything around it and meant the opposite of calm. Put the phone down. The second man turned toward the door. Reyes was behind Draven on the stairs, and behind Reyes were two others she didn't know, and the geometry of the hallway had changed in the way that geometries changed when the number of people in them shifted decisively in one direction. The second man looked at the phone in his hand. He put it down on the floor. Draven came through the bedroom door and crossed the room in 5 steps, and his hands were on her face before she'd fully processed that he was there. Both palms against her jaw, thumbs at her temples, the specific touch of someone conducting a rapid physical assessment and trying to make it look like something else. "You're bleeding," he said. "My palms." I caught myself on the floor. She put her hands up over his. "I'm fine. Draven, I'm fine. Look at me." He looked at her. She looked back. The room was still loud with the rain and the specific aftermath noise of a confrontation. The men behind him, the man on the floor who had gotten fully upright and was being handled by Reyes with efficient and impersonal efficiency. And underneath all of it, the sound of her own heartbeat beginning its slow descent from the register it had been operating in for the last 12 minutes. "I hit the first one with the fire extinguisher," she said. Something crossed his face, complex and fast. He's not seriously hurt. Upper back impact, he'll bruise." She looked at the man, who was currently allowing himself to be escorted from the room with the resigned cooperation of someone who had accurately assessed the revised odds. "I've had worse outcomes." Draven was still looking at her. "I'm not fragile," she said. "I know." His voice was very quiet. "I know exactly how not fragile you are." His hands moved from her face to her shoulders to her hands, turning her palms up, looking at the abrasion, his jaw tightening slightly at what he saw. "Come here." She let him lead her to the edge of the bed. He went to the bathroom and came back with a damp towel and crouched in front of her and cleaned her palms with the same methodical, careful attention she had brought to his wound on a living room floor 6 weeks ago. She watched the top of his head and thought about circles and how they closed. "The second man," she said, "he was Iris's insurance." "Yes." He didn't look up from her hands. "There's a third person we didn't know about. Someone between Iris and Verano who ran parallel to everything. Not under my organization, freelance. Iris hired him directly 8 months ago as a contingency." He turned her right hand carefully, examining the abrasion's extent. "I should have looked for it. I knew Iris was careful and I still didn't look for it." "You found everything else." "Not fast enough." "Fast enough for tonight," she said. "Fast enough for this." He looked up at her then. They were very close. The lamp in the corner was the only light in the room, everything else swallowed by storm dark, and his face in that light had the specific unguarded quality she had seen only a handful of times. Late at the brownstone table, the hallway outside the elevator, the moment he'd put his hand on her arm and said, "I intend to be something different." "The meeting," she said. "Verano, it's done." He took the offer. He took the offer. He sat back on his heels. He walked away. She held his gaze. "How do you feel?" He considered this with his usual seriousness. Like something ended. A pause. And like I don't know yet what starts. That's honest. You've made me more honest. I'm not sure that's entirely comfortable. She almost smiled. Good. He stood, looked at the door, looked back at her. We need to move you again. This location is Draven. She stood up too. I want to go home. He started to say something. I want to go home, she repeated. To my apartment, on Ashland. She held his gaze. If it's not safe for me to go back to my own apartment, then we have a problem that no number of additional relocations is going to solve. He was quiet for a moment. The second man's employer will be dealt with tonight, he said carefully. I know. And Holt is for Camille to report through the hospital's compliance channel, which she is going to do first thing tomorrow morning, which is the process I extracted from you as a non-negotiable and which I intend to hold you to. She looked at him steadily. Is my apartment safe? A pause. Yes, he said. By morning. Then take me home. Tits. They rode through the storm in the back of Rhea's car without speaking much, and the not speaking was a different kind than all the silences that had come before it in the last 6 weeks. Not the careful silence of two people managing their distance, not the operational silence of people working through a problem. Just the silence of two people who were tired all the way down and had nothing left to perform for each other, and had arrived, without announcing it, at the specific mutual ease that was either the beginning of something or its truest form. The city moved past the rain-blurred windows, Chicago doing what it always did, indifferent and alive, its particular combination of beauty and brutality continuing in every direction regardless of what had just concluded in a warehouse on the Calumet River and a brownstone in Pilsen. "The man from the warehouse," Nyla said. Not loudly, just into the car's quiet. "The one who grabbed me on the street 6 weeks ago." Draven turned to look at her. "He works for the second asset, the freelancer." He paused. "He's been identified." "And Verano won't move on him?" "Verano won't move on anything. Not for a long time." He held her gaze. "He lost his inside access and his operational map in the same night. He has to rebuild from nothing in corridors that are now restructured against him." A pause. "He's a careful man. Careful men don't make expensive moves when they're blind. But he's still out there." "Yes." He said it honestly, without softening. "He's still out there. And the world I've been in for 15 years doesn't disappear because one negotiation went well." His voice was very steady. "I'm not going to tell you everything is resolved. That would be a lie." She looked at him. "I know. I'm going to tell you that you are safe. That whatever I restructure and whatever I step away from and whatever I build instead, your safety is not a variable I'm leaving to chance." His jaw was set. "That is the one thing I will be absolute about." She thought about that for a moment. "Draven?" "Yes." "Don't make me a structure you maintain." She held his gaze. "I'm a person you know. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. "There is. I want the second version." "I know." A pause. "So do I." Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. Not gone, not finished, but the sustained ferocity of it breaking up into something less absolute. Rain still fell, but with more space between drops, the sky lightening fractionally from black to the dark gray of a city night, instead of a storm's erasure of everything. Ashland Avenue came up through the windshield. Her block. The street lamps burning steady and orange exactly as they had been since the night someone repaired them at midnight without being asked. Rhea stopped in front of her building. She looked up at the facade. Second floor windows dark. The dry cleaner below, shut for the night. An ordinary building on an ordinary street that had, in the last 6 weeks, become the location of more consequence than it had probably held in the previous decade. "Come up," she said. Draven looked at her. "Not for anything complicated," she said. "Because you've been awake for 2 days and driven through a storm and walked into a room with Rafael Verano and then driven across the city convinced I was in danger, and because my couch is comfortable and my grandmother's quilts are still in the cedar chest." She held his gaze. "And because neither of us should be alone with this tonight." A long moment. "All right," he said. Miss. She made tea because there was nothing else to make at 2:30 in the morning, and he sat at her kitchen table, the small one, the same table where she'd once sat on the floor beside it at midnight with a phone in her hand and sent a text about the math of bad days. And she put a cup in front of him and sat across from him, and they drank their tea in a silence that had the quality of something finally exhaled after being held too long. "Tell me about the clinic," she said. He looked up. "The real version, not the crisis version." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "You said 2 blocks from the community center. Tell me what you actually imagine." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his tea. Then slowly, like something being carefully unfolded. "The ground floor for walk-in care. No appointment required. No insurance requirement." He paused. "The second floor for the community center work. Somewhere Darius and the others could actually go without it being a clinic, without it having that—" He searched for the word. "Institutional feeling," she supplied. "Yes." "And the funding. I have enough to build it and run it for 3 years without needing external support. After that, it would need to be self-sustaining. He looked at her. I know people in nonprofit structures. I'm learning about the ones I didn't. A pause. I've been learning about them for about 6 weeks. She looked at him across the kitchen table. You've been planning this, she said slowly. I've been thinking about what a different version looks like. He turned the cup in his hands. Concretely, instead of abstractly. A pause. For the first time. What changed? He looked at her steadily. You know what changed. She held his gaze. I want to hear you say it. You, he said simply. You changed it. Not by asking me to. Not by telling me who to be. His voice was very quiet. By being exactly who you are and not pretending you were fine with what I was, and also not walking away from it. He put the cup down. I've had people tell me to stop before. Cortez told me for years, but they said it and then stayed inside the same structure. A pause. You were the first person who showed me what the outside of it looked like, what it could actually look like. His jaw tightened slightly. That made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Nyla sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the rain was gentle now, the last of the storm moving through, losing its fury, becoming something softer and ordinary. She could hear it on the window above the sink, a steady small sound, comfortable in its diminishment. Cortez would have liked this plan, she said. Something moved across his face. She watched it. The grief that he carried with the same compressed economy he carried everything, and that she had learned to see even when he wasn't showing it. Yes, he said. He would have argued with me about the location. He had opinions about every building on the south side. A pause. He would have been right. We should let him be right about the location. He looked at her. He was your partner, she said, for 14 years. Let the building be partly his. She held his gaze. Name a room after him. Name the whole thing after him, if you want. He was very still. That's, he started, stopped. A good idea, she said. It's a good idea, and you know it. He looked down at his hands on the table. When he looked back up, his eyes had the specific quality she associated with him saying something true that cost him something. Yes, he said. It is. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not dramatically, just there. The contact that she had come to understand was its own language between them, simple and direct and meaning exactly what it was. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while. In her kitchen above Ashland Avenue, with the rain coming down light and steady, and the city moving below, and the specific ordinary beauty of two people at a table at 2 a.m, holding each other's hands, while everything outside slowly settled into something quieter. He slept on the couch. She lay in her bed and listened to the rain finish and the city reassert itself in the absence of the storm. The first birds before dawn, the dry cleaner's early delivery, the train 2 blocks over carrying its first passengers of the morning. And she thought about the last 6 weeks in the specific way you thought about a period of time that had compressed years of consequence into days. She thought about a sidewalk and a pulse too faint to count on, about a coat on a door handle and a phone number written without signature, about a table in a West Loop penthouse covered in evidence of a world she had chosen with full information to step closer to rather than away from, about 48 hours and closed nodes and a man telling her what different looked like when he was still learning to see it himself. She thought about Cortez, whom she had never met and would never meet, and about the debt she felt she owed him. The man who had spent 14 years telling Draven Vale that something better was possible and had paid for that belief with everything, and who deserved to be right. She thought about Darius, who had been offered a position, and who she would see in 2 days at the community center, and about what she might say to him differently now. About the specific thing you understood when you had spent 6 weeks inside a world where the door he was standing in front of was visible from both sides. She thought about the clinic, its bones, the building 2 blocks from the center that had good architecture and the right dimensions, and a room that needed a name. She fell asleep thinking about what color to paint the waiting room. The morning came in the specific way Chicago mornings came in late February, cautious, gray, withholding the light like it was still deciding whether to commit. But the storm was fully gone, and the streets below were wet and clear, and the city had the particular washed feeling of a place that had been through something and was now in the first hours of after. She woke to the smell of coffee. She lay still for a moment, registering it, and then got up and went to the kitchen in the clothes she'd slept in and found Draven at her counter with 2 cups already made. He had found everything: the coffee, the filters, the specific way her machine worked. And she did not ask how, because she had learned that his attention to the specific facts of her life was a language she had stopped being surprised by. He handed her a cup. She took it. They stood at the counter for a moment, looking out the window above the sink at the gray morning street below. A woman walking a dog, a car with its hazards on, someone loading groceries. Ordinary city morning, doing what it did. "Holt," she said. Camille reported it to the hospital compliance officer at 7:15 this morning. He paused. "I had someone verify. He'll be investigated." "Yes." "Will Verano's people try to protect him?" "No. He's not useful to Verano anymore, and using resources to protect a liability draws attention neither of them can afford right now." A pause. "He'll face the process." "That's what he deserves," she said. "The process. Not something faster." "Yes," Draven said. She looked at him. He was looking out the window, profile toward her, and she thought about the first morning she'd left him here. The note with the phone number, the folded quilts, the blood on the floor she'd cleaned on her knees. The beginning of a story she hadn't known was starting. "What happens today?" she said. "I have meetings. People who need to understand what's changed and what the new structure is." He turned to look at her. "Things that will take weeks to fully transition. And then? And then I start the other thing." A pause. "The building, the permits, whatever comes after." He held her gaze. "I have someone I want to consult on the medical infrastructure." "She's very expensive," Nyla said. "She works for coffee," he said. "I've observed this." She almost laughed. Didn't quite. Smiled instead, which was something she'd been doing more of in the last 6 weeks than she had in the year before it, and which she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. "Go have your meetings," she said. "Come back when they're done." He looked at her for a moment. "That's simple." "That's simple." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "You know where I live." "I know where you live very precisely," he said. "I know you do." She met his eyes. "Come back." He put his cup down on the counter, crossed the kitchen, stood in front of her in the specific close way they had been standing in various kitchens and hallways and doorways over the last 6 weeks. And she looked up at him with the full weight of everything she knew about him, the wound and the storm and the table covered in documents and Cortez's name and the photograph on her street and 2 men in a brownstone bedroom in a warehouse and a man who had learned to tell the truth in the careful, unhurried way of someone who had spent years not knowing how. And he looked back at her with the same weight. He put his hand against her face, just his palm, against her jaw. She put her hand over his. He bent and kissed her once, carefully, with the specific, unhurried quality of something that was not a beginning and not an ending, but something that had been true for a while and was only now being said out loud. When he stepped back, she was still holding her coffee cup. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she said. He left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the street until she saw him come out of the building entrance below and get into the car that was waiting, and then the car pulled into the gray morning traffic and was gone. And she stood there a moment longer in the ordinary light of an ordinary day that was somehow both completely unremarkable and the first morning of something she didn't have a full name for yet. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in Chicago. Not a switch being flipped, but an argument won by degrees. Thus, a day above 40, then 2 together, then a week where the ice on the side streets finally committed to leaving. The air changed. The quality of the light changed. The city came out of itself by increments, emerging from the specific bunker mentality of a Chicago winter into something that moved differently on the sidewalks and breathed differently through the open windows of the elevated trains. Nyla's clinic opened on a Thursday in April. The building had taken 6 weeks of permits and 3 weeks of construction and 2 weeks of Draven arguing with contractors about specific details with an intensity she had found both unnecessary and quietly magnificent. The waiting room was painted the color she had fallen asleep thinking about in the brownstone bedroom, a warm gold that caught the afternoon light and held it. The front door was propped open on the first day with a doorstop shaped like a book that Maya had given her as an opening gift. The sign above the entrance read, Val Cortez Community Health Center. She had not asked for the first name. He had put it there without discussion, and she had looked at it for a long time the morning they hung it, and felt something so complex she didn't try to simplify it. No patient would be turned away, no insurance required, no immigration status asked. By noon of the first day, they had seen 14 patients. By the end of the week, they had a waiting list that Nyla was already negotiating expanded hours to address. Darius came on the second Tuesday. Not as a patient, as a volunteer. He showed up in the morning with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set in the specific way of someone who had made a decision they were still working out how to explain, and he said, I told them no. And Nyla said, I know. And then she showed him where the supply room was and taught him how to run intake, and by the end of the day, he was doing it with the focused competence of a person who was good at things when the things mattered. By June, he was talking about nursing programs. Draven's restructured organization ran leaner and cleaner, as he had described it, less dependent on fear, more distributed with more legal buffer between its visible operations and the ones that weren't. It was not a transformation into something innocent. She did not pretend it was. The world he operated in had not become a different world because of 6 weeks in a warehouse in a new building 2 blocks from the community center. But it was different. In the specific incremental way things became different when a person made different choices over enough time. The violence that had followed him like a shadow became less frequent and then less routine, and then something that appeared to require his authorization rather than operating autonomously, which was a change that was only visible if you knew what you were looking for. She knew what she was looking for. She had been in the world long enough to understand that people did not become new people. They became more intentional versions of what they already were. If they were lucky and willing and had someone who expected more of them, not by demanding it, but by assuming it. She assumed better of Draven Vale because she had seen him be better in real conditions under real pressure, and she held that knowledge against all the complicated rest of what he was, and she chose it. He showed up at the clinic on a Tuesday evening in May after his meetings, because that had become the pattern. Meetings, then the clinic, then her apartment or his. The quiet, ordinary rhythm of 2 people building a life in the spaces between everything else they carried. That evening, she was in the supply room taking inventory when she heard him come in, heard him exchange a few words with Darius at the front desk, and she stayed where she was because she wanted to hear it. The specific sound of the 2 of them talking, Darius and Draven, who had nothing in common except the axis of her life, and who had somehow, across 3 months of Tuesday evenings, developed the specific ease of people who had decided to make sense of each other. She heard Draven say something about nursing programs, heard him say a name, someone he knew, apparently, who ran admissions at a program she recognized. Heard Darius say really in the voice of someone recalibrating what was possible. She stood in the supply room with a clipboard and let that sound happen without her in it. Then she went out. He was standing at the front desk with his coat on, the same black coat, or one like it. She had long since stopped tracking which. And he looked up when she came in, and she watched his face do the thing it always did when she came into a room, which was become slightly more present, the way a room's temperature changed by 1 degree. Inventory? He said. We're low on basic wound dressings, she said. Again, we go through them faster than I projected. I'll have Reyes get more. Reyes doesn't need to. Reyes enjoys it, Draven said. It gives him something to do that doesn't involve standing in warehouses. Darius was looking between them with the expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what he witnessed on Tuesday evenings and had simply filed it under the category of things the world contained that were more complicated than they looked. Go home, Nyla told him. You've been here since 8. I'm fine, he said. I know you're fine. Go home. She held his gaze. Tomorrow you're going to call the number he just gave you. Darius looked at Draven, looked at Nyla. Yeah, he said. Okay. He picked up his jacket, paused at the door. The woman with the kid who came in at 3, she asked if she could come back on Thursday. The door is open on Thursday, Nyla said. He nodded. Left. The clinic was quiet. The afternoon light was doing something gold and specific through the waiting room windows. The angle of spring light at 6 in the evening in Chicago, doing what it only did for about 3 weeks a year, catching the buildings and the trees and the glass of the windows at an angle that turned everything briefly into something more beautiful than it usually admitted to being. Draven was looking at the sign above the front door, the one that said Vale Cortez. She went to stand beside him. He would hate the font, Draven said. What was wrong with the font? He had opinions about fonts, very specific opinions. A pause. He would have said it was too formal. We can change it. No. He was quiet for a moment. Leave it. He would have argued about it every time he walked through the door. Something moved in his voice. That would have been appropriate. She looked at the sign, at the waiting room with its warm gold walls and its donated chairs and its propped open door and the specific smell of a clean space that was being used for what it was built for. 14 years from now, she said slowly, when this building is running itself and has a staff I didn't have to hire and a waiting list so long we'll need to open a second location. She paused. Yes, he said. What does that look like for you? He turned to look at her. The evening light was doing the thing it did, catching the angles of his face, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him from the beginning, not past the difficult parts and not despite them, but including them, the full accounting. Smaller, he said, quieter. A pause. Here, specifically here, or something like it. That's enough, she said. That's what it needs to look like. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. Outside, Chicago moved on exactly as it always had. The L train 3 blocks over rattled its sparks into the evening air. Cars moved through the intersection at the end of the street with the ordinary urgency of people going home. Somewhere down the block, someone was cooking something that drifted through the open door of the clinic and mixed with the smell of fresh paint and antiseptic and coffee. And the combination was strange and specific, and nothing at all like anything that had a name, and somehow exactly right. Draven reached down and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just his hand closing around hers in the way that had become the specific private language of two people who had stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. The language of someone who had learned, finally, after a very long time, that protection and possession were different things, and that the difference was what made it real. She held his hand. They stood in the doorway of a clinic on the south side, while the evening light fell across the waiting room windows and turned everything gold. And outside the city did what it always did. Kept going, kept living, kept making its particular impossible beautiful noise. And inside, in the specific stillness of two people who had paid for this moment in every currency available to them and were now simply present in it, the storm that had begun on a February sidewalk in the dark was finally, completely, over. Not because the world had become easier, not because either of them had become someone other than who they were, but because they had learned something that most people spent their whole lives working toward and not quite reaching, that you could know the full truth of a person, the damage and the capacity and the history and the cost, and choose them anyway. That choosing with eyes open wasn't recklessness. It was the only thing that counted. Nyla Bennett had pulled a man off a sidewalk in a blizzard because she'd needed to do something that worked. It had worked. That was enough. That was everything.